The Turkish president elected for another term. Supporters took to the streets to celebrate a comfortable victory for Recep Tayyip Erdogan with 52% of the vote in Sunday's runoff. So what should we expect over the next 5 years, and where will Ankara's priorities lie? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Turkey's election. It was a historic election for Turkey. 2 weeks ago, neither incumbent President Erdogan nor Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu managed to secure the 50% needed to avoid a second round of voting. So for the first time in the history of the Turkish Republic, a runoff election was held. Securing a comfortable majority, Erdogan will now have 5 more years to address some pressing issues facing the country. He spoke to crowds on Sunday night from Ankara, thanking everyone for voting and calling for unity.
Yaralarını sarmak.
Healing the wounds of February 6 earthquakes, the disaster of the century, and restoring our demolished cities will continue to be at the top of our priorities. Not only our hearts, but also our hands will continue to be with the earthquake zone. Addressing the problems caused by inflation-driven price hikes and compensating the wealth losses are the most urgent issues on the days ahead.
And while the work within Turkey will continue outside its borders, foreign leaders are now looking at how Erdogan's continuing time in office will affect their relations. After the war in Ukraine started, Erdogan emerged as a key power broker, negotiating the Black Sea grain deal, which unlocked millions of tons of wheat, helping to avert a global hunger crisis. He also controls the second largest army in NATO, and thanks to its strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, Turkey has proven to be an indispensable NATO ally. In recent years, Erdogan has also pursued a process of normalization with Middle Eastern countries, aiming to mend strained relationships. Now it appears both Western and Eastern leaders want to maintain good ties with the country, as they were quick to congratulate the president on Sunday night. So, how was the election won, and what might change for Turkey and the world? Well, joining me now to talk more about that are in the studio with me Taha Meli Arvas, Adjunct Professor of Finance at Bogazici University. From Istanbul, Tarik Oguzlu, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Istanbul Aydin University. And from Washington, Outzen, Geopolitical Consultant and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in Turkey. Thanks all so much for being with us. I'm going to start broad, and I'll start in the studio with you, Taha. Why did Erdogan win this election?
I think the populace looked at this as we're in a global economic downturn. A potential great recession is waiting for us on the other side of this inflationary period. So who can best help, or who can best navigate these troubled waters, was the question. I don't think, frankly, that's half of the equation. The other half of the equation is it's not necessarily that Erdogan won, it's that the opposition lost. This is a party that's never won an election. It's been 100 years, and frankly, they don't really understand how to campaign. There is no baby kissing, there is no handshaking, there is no, I mentioned this to someone a couple days ago. Fareed Zakaria refers to the opposition candidate as a colorless bureaucrat with no eloquence or charisma, which is not the height of his praise, obviously, but that's the reality. We had a non-charismatic opposition leader. So President Erdogan, as we saw in his victory speech, he sang to the public. He's a great politician. Yeah, I think anyone, despite your politics, whatever you believe, he's a professional at that. And the people said, who should I go with? The guy who's been doing this for so long, who's been through so many crises, or this other guy who's never won an election, who's lost 11 elections, and they chose the President Erdogan.
Why did they choose the opposition? Why did they choose Kılıçdaroğlu in the first place?
That's the $64 billion question right there. It boggles my mind. I have no idea. I have friends from both sides. There's a problem with Turkish political parties, I believe. The elite, kind of like some corporate structures in the United States, the CEO chooses the board of directors, and the board of directors chooses the CEO. There's a vested interest in the party elite to keep the chairman, and there's a vested interest in the chairman to keep the party elite. And despite it being against their best interests, in the best interest of the party, they chose the least electable candidate. And there we have it, and we saw what happened.
Right. And I just one quick point with you, because you brought up, the economy, and I think pollsters got it wrong in thinking that because the economy is struggling, like so many others at this point, it was going to cost Erdogan. And that actually wasn't what's really on voters' minds.
Right. I think that's a very simplistic way to look at things. I think what people need is people need to feel proud of themselves. They need to feel good about themselves. They need to know that the person they've chosen believes in them. And there's no one better at that, at conveying that message than President Erdogan. We saw that yesterday. And he continually did that through the campaign. We've established that the CHP, not only itself is a party that has never won an election in 100 years, but this candidate was the least electable candidate. So I would have been shocked if the president lost, frankly. By any other measure, the opposition should have won. We're in this economic downturn. Like I said, there's a global economic crisis. If it were just up to the economy, then President Erdogan should have almost certainly lost. Okay. But that didn't happen.
Tarik, I'll come to you. And I mean, it is so interesting to get this perspective from Turkish people, because from the outside, it's hard to judge the charisma, the messaging of a candidate if you don't speak the language that they are speaking. And I think a lot of people outside the country didn't fully understand. They kept labeling Kılıçdaroğlu the Gandhi of Turkey. They didn't really know how he sounded necessarily to Turks. Is that fair, Tarik?
Up to a point, yes, it might be a fair observation, but we should not forget the fact that if you approach these elections from a Western circle, the kind of picture you will have will be totally different. If we approach the election from a Middle Eastern or Eastern European or East Asian picture, the people who approach the election from the Western circles tend to feel a little bit sympathetic with Kılıçdaroğlu, despite all kind of lack of charisma on his side, because they had the view that if Kılıçdaroğlu were given the opportunity to rule the country, Turkey's relations with the Western countries will improve once again, and Kılıçdaroğlu will be able to shift Turkey's course back to traditional economic mainstream policies. But if you ask this question to people in the wider Middle Eastern geography, they would most likely see President Erdogan remain in power and continue to rule the country as it has been doing so far, because President Erdogan seems to have established a high degree of rapport with the people of the region. I was at the RT World Studio during the election program. I had noticed that the people in the Middle Eastern countries were celebrating the victory of President Erdogan, which suggests that they had also identified themselves with this guy, no matter they live in different countries. So they had the idea that whatever Erdogan says might also help them improve their status in the international political order as well. So Erdogan is seen as a kind of representative of the people in the wider Middle Eastern geography. This also suggests that Erdogan was not only targeting the people at home, but also the people abroad. So this should be seen as a quite success story on his part.
Okay. Let me turn to Rich now in Washington. I mean, you've got unique perspective because you know Turkey well, but you're also a foreign observer in this case. So what do you make of the analyses you've just heard?
Well, I think that I agree with most of what the previous speakers have said. The West has an empirical problem when it comes to not just Turkish elections, but Turkish politics and, frankly, Turkish policy in general. And by that, I mean there's a lot of mirror imaging. Washington tends to interpret political actors in Turkey through the lens of their own experiences. They comparing Kılıçdaroğlu to Gandhi is perhaps the easiest metaphor to grab, but it misses a ton of nuance. So I think the fact that most of the Turkey analysis that goes on in Washington is done by people who don't go to Turkey very frequently, don't identify with the sort of conservative nationalists center of gravity on the Turkish political spectrum, and want to see a very different sort of political direction or set of dynamics in Turkey, means that they're going to get it wrong. They're not talking to enough Middle Anatolian voters. They're not talking to nationalists. They're not talking to AKP people because, frankly, this anathematization in Washington, where people assert that Turkey is defined purely by Erdogan, and Erdogan is seen in normatively negative terms. Therefore, they really don't want to poke in under the hood and figure out what's going on. So to me, that's one of the big stories here, is that the West, again, has gotten it wrong because of kind of superficial and non-empirical narrative analysis.
But I mean, Rich, it's not the first time, and it's not just with Turkey. Why don't they learn? I'm phrasing it simply, but yeah, why don't they learn? Why don't they listen more to analysts like yourself?
So it's a hard sell. Remember, to be fair to my countrymen, we are a country of 330 million on a continental scale. So when we are following politics to the extent that Americans outside of Washington do follow politics, it's mostly U.S. domestic politics. So the amount of bandwidth to follow even things like war in Ukraine, India-Pakistan tensions, competition, great power rivalry with China, it's just very limited. So the average American doesn't think about Turkey very often. Now, I don't blame Americans for not understanding Turkish politics and for getting it wrong. Washington's different.
That's what I'm talking about, Washington itself, yeah.
You would expect that there would be a learning curve after 20 years of watching Erdogan either as prime minister or as president run the country, and something more of an empathetic look. Even if you don't agree with his policies or don't like him personally, you need a little empathy in your analysis to understand why he keeps winning. And I think that there's disinclination to do that has a lot to do with sort of domestic political formations with regards to which I think lobbies, and it's human rights lobbies, it's religious freedom lobbies, it's not just ethnic lobbies. There are a lot of folks who score domestic political points by appearing strong on Turkey, even if they're wrong on Turkey.
Interesting. Okay, Taha, let me come back to you. And I want to spend too much time looking back on how this result came out. But I mean, was there any one group or demographic that actually, proved to be the so-called kingmaker in this election? Was it Sinan Oğan and his followers?
Ironically, there wasn't, because he got 5% of the vote, and then in the follow-up, in the runoff, they split his vote. So he got half of his supporters switched to Erdogan, and the other half switched to Kılıçdaroğlu. So, and we saw that there are varying degrees of conservatives on both sides. There are varying degrees of nationalists on both sides. It's a very interesting mix. If you told me that there was going to be an opposition leader with 7 different parties that came together, and then of those parties, half of them left and joined Erdogan's side, I would never have believed you a couple of weeks ago. It was one for the record books. I think it's very interesting in that respect. And we'll see what happens going forward. But I think the opposition really needs to take a deep look at what they've done wrong and rebrand themselves at the very least.
The other question was, in the lead up to the election, when there was all this polling saying the opposition was set to win, it was what would happen post-election. And, had they won, could we have seen another Israel scenario whereby that broad but ideologically opposed coalition that only actually shares one thing in common, and that's to defeat the incumbent, would it all have just fallen apart after a few months and actually made the situation worse for everyone?
I think that was one of the arguments. And then after the initial election, Kılıçdaroğlu did a 180, complete the so-called liberal Democrat from Western perspective, became this ultra-nationalist, anti-immigrant force that bordered on racism, frankly. And that took everyone by surprise. Many of his supporters, the actual turnout, despite being very high by Western standards, was less than the first election. I think a couple million people were turned off by his turn, and that may have helped President Erdogan win.
Do you agree there, Tarik? Do you think that ultra-nationalist turn and this xenophobic rhetoric actually turned against Kılıçdaroğlu?
I need to tell you that Ümit Özdağ siding with Kılıçdaroğlu played a very negative role in the outcomes of the latest runoff session, because this has led a quite number of people who supported Kurdish parties in the first round decided to vote not only against Erdogan, also but remain absent. Maybe most of those people didn't go and cast their ballots, because that's a very important conclusion we should draw. If Kılıçdaroğlu did not get into a kind of interaction with Özdağ, or if we assume Sinan Oğan had remained as silent as possible, maybe the majorities of the Southeastern people will still vote for Kılıçdaroğlu, and maybe Kılıçdaroğlu would have won the game. This is a speculation. I am aware of this particularly important fact, that we should not underline the fact that these traditional Kurdish people didn't feel quite happy with the presence of Ümit Özdağ in this so-called nation alliance. Because Ümit Özdağ, as you have just pointed out, was making it very clear that if I were given a chance, I would put into context an extremely far-right and anti-immigrationist policy. So they didn't appear quite well, and they were not accepted. They were not accepted by the people in the southeastern part of the country. So this was a mistake, a colossal mistake on the part of Kılıçdaroğlu, and it had benefited Erdogan without any hesitation.
Rich, let me ask you, I mean, especially from, an American perspective, it's always kind of frightening, at least in my opinion, to see that kind of almost violent rhetoric that is so xenophobic. We see a lot of it in the U.S. With Trump's election, calling Mexicans rapists, all the kinds of things he said, that really, it changes the dynamics, and it brings up this level of xenophobia that many people, I want to say most people, find deeply disturbing. Did you see the kind of same thing coming about in the way that the opposition turned to the far right over the last 2 weeks here?
Well, to be fair, I think the degree of polarization and sort of harsh language and rhetoric on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States is far in advance of what we've typically seen in Turkey. And as I come from the conservative side of the spectrum myself, I will tell you that the demonization based on race is not just the xenophobia directed at foreigners. There's this whole issue of, the white supremacy rhetoric and narrative that's being pushed by the left as well. So we have both sides in the United States, and that's sort of become a staple of our elections, demonizing the other side. I think it's relatively newer in Turkey. I think this was a sort of an ugly turn that we saw with regards to immigration and the status of Syrians in particular. But there's also been undertones of that in Turkish discourse politically with regards to the PKK, and in some cases, some politicians conflating PKK with Kurdishness. And I mean, I don't think it's entirely new, but it does seem to have taken a worse turn here. I did want to add one thing about the Kurdish vote in Turkey. As far as I can tell, it's not monolithic, right? People in the U.S. and Europe tended to think that the Kurdish vote could swing the election this way or that way. Kurds themselves in Turkey vote very differently. You have a large chunk that vote for Erdogan because they're conservative or pious or in some cases tribally affiliated. You have the sort of HDP a little bit on the left and Kurdish nationalist realm. And then you've got a big chunk that are also living essentially either in mixed families or sort of mixing Turkish and Kurdish identity. So it's not so facile just to say all the Kurds will vote this way or that way. And I think that's another political error that was made in the West. I think the Kurds largely split in this election. Some of them stayed home as a result of the rhetoric we talked about, and some of them preferred Erdogan because of the fact that you're balancing pain tolerance with Erdogan. They know what his faults and shortcomings are with risk tolerance, because you really don't know what you're getting with a large coalition and with someone without the track record.
I do agree, though, Richard. I mean, the fact that they so often outside of Turkey, the Kurds are just presented as this one entity that, and I always said it's like calling the FARC in Colombia the Colombians. They are not the Colombians. They're a very separate group that's actually quite a small minority compared to, like the PKK, for example. But we love to simplify this and just say the Kurds, as if it's all one thing. But yeah, it's a good point to make. I do want to move on, though, to foreign policy now. And Taha, again, I'll begin with you. Really, when we spoke 2 weeks ago, Kılıçdaroğlu just announced he was going to reverse foreign policy 180 degrees. Right. Obviously, that didn't quite sell that easily because, what would really need to change dramatically? I mean, is the status quo going to be fully maintained, or are you expecting at least certain areas of foreign policy to take a different turn?
I think the one thing you can count on President Erdogan being is pragmatic. I think people I've seen label him as an ideologue or this or that. And if you look over the last decade of things that have happened in Turkey, he's actually evolved greatly on a lot of issues. And as a result, I think it would be difficult to find. It would have been difficult to find a leader that could come into this role and very easily navigate the very difficult neighborhood that Turkey is in. Frankly, there's a war to the north. We have Iran and Iraq to the south. Excuse me, to the east. We have Syria to the south. We have economic turmoil in Greece and Bulgaria to the west. Turkey is not a very easy place to lead, to live. I mean, it's a great place to live, but it's a very difficult place.
It's a difficult neighborhood.
It's a very difficult neighborhood, absolutely. And who do you want really, and I'm talking about as a foreign leader, if I were President Biden, who exactly do you want to lead a country like that? When you make a phone call to the president of the country, do you want someone who you know can bring a coalition of people together to pass laws, to implement a policy, or do you want someone who has 6 or 7 vice presidencies that he has to check with, that they have to rule by committee, and then you have this very dangerous response time? And I think even we saw President Macron was one of the first people to congratulate President Erdogan after the win last night of France, who was probably one of the last people you would say he's great friends with President Erdogan. But lo and behold, everyone is looking after their own country's interests.
Yeah.
So to have someone that you can speak with that has experienced adversity, and somehow at the end of the day you come together and you do what's best for your natural interest is what I think they would have gone with. So despite them saying we want a liberal Democrat like Kılıçdaroğlu to come in, I think after the first election they realized maybe that's not what he was after all, and they said, okay, we'll go with this.
Richard, I have to come back to you just because I saw you nodding your head, especially about the Biden point. I mean, though, is this what Biden wanted? Because the impression was that it's not what Americans generally wanted as far as their eye on Turkish foreign policy was concerned.
Right. Well, again, there's all sorts of political rents to be had, so to speak, by having a guy that you know that's relatively predictable in charge of this ally with whom you can, in the end, strike pragmatic deals and will probably stick to those deals, but whom you can also pillory to domestic political audiences for certain things. So I think that there was a genuine sympathy for Kılıçdaroğlu in Washington, and I think especially on the Democratic side of the spectrum, I think there was a genuine desire. There's a lot of people disappointed in Washington by the outcome of the election. But again, the sense of familiarity, and we've got Erdogan running a highly personalized foreign policy. So we know that what his relationship is with Macron, with Putin, not great with Biden, but again, they sort of know each other. They've been following each other around for 10, 12, 14 years back to the Obama administrations. So you sort of know what you're getting, and there are limitations on how good that can get. There's probably also limitations on how bad that can get. So I think disguised beneath the disappointment is a certain level of relief that at least we sort of know what's going to happen for the next 5 years in Turkish foreign policy.
So in that, do you think the U.S. and Turkey can find more common ground on Syria policy?
So I would expect progress before Syria on NATO accession and perhaps F-16s. I think the door is wide open there with Sweden's new counter-PKK and counter-terror laws coming into full effect this summer. I think the road to progress for Swedish accession and then some movement on F-16s, that's a brighter path than on Syria, because in Syria we still have fundamentally opposed interests. Not all of them. I mean, we have common interests on, for instance, the humanitarian situation and taking care of refugees and so forth. But there's an irreducible conflict between the U.S. support to the YPG as a counter-terror force, a counter-ISIS force, and the Turkish desire not to have a PKK affiliate in charge of its border. Now, the other unique challenge here is this is probably going to be Erdogan's last term, right? At least that's what the Constitution says, 2 fully elected terms. He is going to enter a mode of legacy thinking on his foreign policy. One of the things that he will need to put paid to or put a finish to is the conflict in Syria. If he leaves after 5 years and we still have a massive displaced population of Syrians in Turkey and no peace in Syria, I think that will be remembered as something that he failed to resolve on his watch. So he's going to have a real imperative to take action, whether that's another ground operation or normalizing with Assad. He has to change the equation, whereas Washington has zero appetite for changing the equation. They're very much on a status quo
I think
path right now. So I don't see where we can reconcile those two lines.
If I can just jump in there, I think Washington itself is evolving on that last aspect. I don't think Washington believes as strongly in the YPG as it did earlier. Guns for hire never ends greatly. I'll remind you of a 1992, I think, independent article with a big picture of Osama bin Laden calling him a freedom fighter. The British press calling Osama bin Laden a freedom fighter 6 years before the first bombing of the World Trade Center. Just because you can hire someone to fight your enemies doesn't mean it ends well. And I think the YPG will similarly, and I think Washington has realized, may end not as well. So I think they've moved back from that.
Taha, that will have to be the final word. So unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter. Do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.